First of all, I just want to echo Dr. Knopel's words. We are just thrilled to see this great turnout here tonight. I know it's a school night. I know the traffic was a little intimidating, and I'm so grateful that you came out and that we have so many people in our community who are excited about early language and literacy, just like I am. So tonight I'll be talking about supporting oral language development in early childhood classrooms. So I want to begin, this is information that Dr. Knopel actually alluded to in his introduction as well. This is information that many of us are familiar with. And that's the fact that we're not adequately preparing the children in our country to read and understand text. So I'm just sharing here the latest data from the NAEP report, which is often referred to as the nation's report card, right? And you can see in this graph that this past year, only about 35% of students scored at the proficient level on the NAEP, meaning that they can interpret and analyze text. And only 34% of fourth graders didn't meet the basic criteria for reading skill. Okay, and this graph shows that the problem is even more acute for children from poor families. So you'll notice that there's a large 28-point gap in scores between children who qualify for free and reduced price lunch and their peers, and that this gap has been really persistent over time, right? So I am showing you these data not to depress you or alarm you, but really just to frame the seriousness of the challenge. Part of the opportunity we as researchers and educators and administrators have moving forward is to think of some new and innovative solutions for better supporting our students and family and helping them to become stronger readers. So the good news, reading skills are malleable. It's a research term for they can change, right? They're not only determined by genetics, they're not only determined by environmental factors. With careful instruction and thinking carefully about the needs of our kids and families, it's possible for all children to show major improvements in reading. And so this is just one example of a reading intervention where there was careful instruction and children gained quite a bit in a variety of reading skills, just to show that this can and does happen often. So the question for my work is really, how can we better support the success of young readers? So in this presentation, I'll be exploring one avenue in particular. It's not the only avenue, but I think it's a very promising avenue. And this approach really relies on beginning to support literacy as soon as kids enter school. Of course, it's also important to support literacy in the home, but tonight I'll really be focused on the classroom context. So we know that literacy begins way before kids learn their ABCs or before they learn how to sound out a word, right? Some important emergent literacy skills begin developing at birth or even before. So that means that preschool teachers, as the first formal teachers of literacy, play this really key role in laying the foundation for future reading success. So, what is the most important thing early childhood teachers can do to prepare children to be strong readers in fourth grade and beyond? And notice that I'm saying fourth grade and beyond. So think in your mind for a moment. If you saw the title of my talk, you probably know what I'm going to say. So, the research that myself and my colleagues work on is really focused on supporting oral language through talk. So children's oral language is one of the most important factors in helping kids' future reading success. So what does it mean to support oral language? So children's oral language grows through hearing different kinds of talk. So that could include hearing books read out loud. That could include back and forth conversations with their caregivers or their teachers. It's the kind of talk that models the use of new vocabulary words, encourages kids to develop and grow their ideas, demonstrates and practices new sentence structures, helps kids understand what they hear. So all that text in blue, those are what we call oral language skills. And we call them oral language skills in pre-K because children aren't reading yet, right? As children get older, we call them language skills or even academic language skills. So it's a little confusing sometimes to think about supporting preschoolers' oral language because most of the time, when our children are typically developing, they come to school being able to speak at least one language, right? But there's a really wide gulf between the kind of language we need to understand a conversation versus the kind of language we need to understand text. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about building the kind of language that supports success in school across a range of subjects. So it's really the language that's needed to learn from a science textbook, for example, or to write an essay, or to understand a news article, right? And that's the kind of language skills that develop really slowly over time. Okay, so why are oral language skills so important? It's really because these skills are integral to reading. So you can see this little equation at the bottom of my screen. This is called the simple view of reading. It's called simple because it's pretty simple, right? It leaves out some other things that are important for reading, like motivation and engagement, but it highlights the two main cognitive skills that are necessary for reading comprehension. So reading comprehension relies on decoding skills, and decoding is just a way of saying anything that has to do with print. So see my friendly letters up there? So decoding skills are learning your letters, learning your sounds, learning the patterns of language and phonics. And then language comprehension are the skills that have to do more with listening and aren't connected to text. So they're things like vocabulary, grammar, and listening comprehension. So reading comprehension cannot take place without both of these things, right? If you think about this as a math equation, anything times 0 is 0, right? So if you can't decode and you can't understand what's on the page, you won't be able to understand what you're reading. One more thing about language comprehension. So if you're having trouble thinking about which skills these are, I like to just take the print out of the equation. Think about if you're listening to an audiobook, you'd still have to understand the vocabulary, you'd still have to be able to listen to and figure out those complex sentence structures. So those are the skills that are involved in these language comprehension skills. Oh, I keep clicking my clicker. Okay. These skills, however, develop on really different timelines, and they become critical in the reading process at different times. So decoding skills are most important for reading in the early grades. They're really, really important here, right? They need to be taught explicitly and systematically in order for children to be able to read. And in contrast, oral language, as I said, it begins developing at birth and it keeps developing through adulthood. Even now as adults, we're still learning new vocabulary words, we're still learning how to read different kinds of texts, right? So it's really a lifelong journey developing these oral language skills. But a problem sometimes occurs in pre-K and even some of the early grades when we're not putting focused attention towards prioritizing and teaching oral language, like we might towards something like teaching letters, for example. So kids really draw on these resources of oral language they've built over time to understand what they've read, but if we drop out these oral language skills in the early grades, they're not able to draw on them later on. So one example for you. I want you to take a look at these two different texts. One is a kindergarten text and one is a 6th grade text. And just think about what kind of skills would kids need to have to understand each of these texts. So I'll give you just a moment to read them. So you probably noticed that the kindergarten text, it's got some short words, short sentences, right? Some repeated words. It's really focused on building kids' decoding skills, right? Which is important. But when our children get into 6th grade and see a text like this, it not only requires decoding skills, it also requires vocabulary, right? We've got words like swarming, mass, occurrence. There's some really complex sentences with a lot of clauses. And we can't wait to build up these resources of vocabulary and syntax that children need to understand this text. We need to be supporting them all along, right? And that way, when they get to 6th grade, they're ready and able to understand the text on the right-hand side. Sometimes we talk about it as the difference between learning to read versus reading to learn, right? Okay. In case I have not convinced you yet that oral language is important for reading, I'm going to give you just a little bit more evidence from the research. So children with stronger oral language skills in preschool and kindergarten have stronger reading comprehension in 2nd grade and in 4th grade. Also, longitudinal studies, where they followed the kids over time, have found that kids who had preschool teachers who supported their oral language had stronger reading comprehension in 4th grade than their peers, okay? Hopefully I've convinced you by now. Okay, so how can we support children's oral language in the classroom? So first, I want to just share the theoretical perspective I'm coming from. I'll be drawing on a long tradition of research that tells us how children's language develops. And I'm really viewing language development here as sociocognitive. So what does that mean? It means that it's cognitive in that language takes place partially in the brain, right? Our children's brains especially are wired and primed for language, especially in the early years. So that's the cognitive piece. But language development is also social. It's shaped by social and cultural contexts. So the kind of language we use in school and in texts is different from the kind of language practices children may experience at home. And it's our responsibility as educators to explicitly teach and help all children access the kind of language we value in school. Language is also social in that it develops through interaction. So I think of it as like two sides of a coin. Children need to hear language, right? They need to hear language that's more sophisticated than the language they can produce to help their language grow. It's like the zone of proximal development, right? But they also need the chance to try out their developing language skills. And sometimes in the classroom, that's where we don't give enough space for children to do that second thing. So research has shown that a lot of preschools really focus on teacher rather than child talk. And many schools, especially serving kids from low-income families, don't provide adequate support for oral language development. So for example, there was a large study of schools serving low SES families, and they found that only 6% of the day was devoted to teacher-child conversations. And the rest of the talk during the day was almost all management talk, behavioral talk, procedural talk, which of course, these are pre-K children, they need some of that, but they also need support for their oral language. And this is really of particular concern given that these children are also at risk for later reading difficulties. Okay, so proceeding with that understanding of how language develops, I'm going to turn to some more practical strategies for building language in the classroom. So right now, a colleague and I are engaged in a research project where we're looking at all the studies that have examined how teacher talk supports oral language, right? So we started off with like 5,000 studies and have kind of winnowed down from there. And we're finding that there's really two common types of talk that have been found to support kids' oral language skills. There's responsive talk, which I'll discuss in a moment, but it's just what it sounds like, talk that responds to children. And then there's conceptual talk. Conceptual talk, sometimes in the literature they call it knowledge building talk also. It's talk about topics or concepts. So explaining new words, giving explanations, talking about the future or the past, or building understanding in science or other content areas. So one key to increasing the conceptual talk in the classroom is to use books and topics that support the use of this talk. It can be hard to just share this kind of talk sort of off the cuff, but this is where your curriculum and the books you choose for shared book reading can be really, really helpful. So books are really helpful in increasing the amount of conceptual talk because the language in books is more complex than spoken language, and it often covers ideas that spark some rich conversations in your classroom. And it's also important to choose themes and topics that support conceptual talk and build knowledge. So science topics are particularly good for this, and they capitalize on children's natural curiosity about the world. Sometimes pre-K curricula aren't challenging enough, or they don't have the rich, deep content because we worry that maybe it's not developmentally appropriate for young children. But pre-K children are actually able to handle more complex ideas than we realize. And there's a lot of great curricula out there that do have some more substantive science content embedded in it. So one key aspect of conceptual talk is building vocabulary knowledge. And I like to think of building conceptual knowledge through vocabulary as building networks of knowledge. So sometimes we think about teaching new vocabulary as like we have our list of vocabulary words, we have our definitions, maybe we teach a word that like comes up in a book and then teach a definition that goes along with it. So we teach the word enormous, we teach the word significant, right? But the words aren't necessarily related to each other, and they're not necessarily related to a larger topic. We have some emerging evidence from research that suggests that it's effective to instead focus on building knowledge of an overall topic and then teaching words that are sort of embedded in that knowledge network. So you can see here, these graphics are a model of how word knowledge is represented in our minds. And you can see that our knowledge of words tends to cluster together, right? So we learn words more easily when they're related to topics that we already know something about. So the takeaway for word learning and for instruction is that it's helpful to teach words and concepts that relate to one another or that can build on children's prior knowledge. So I'm going to share with you some research I conducted that was focused on building these knowledge networks through shared book reading and play. And I picked those two activities because they're naturally contain rich language, they're developmentally appropriate, and most important, they're engaging and fun for kids, right? So to teach these new concepts and words, we chose informational texts about plants. And there's a page from one of our books. And we read each book 4 times, which may seem like a lot, but you'll see when you see my results that that was helpful. We also did play activities where kids had the chance to try out using the new words they learned. So remember that there's that piece of like, they have to use it, right? They have to try out their emerging word knowledge. And during the book reading and play, we really focused on talking about the relationships between words. We wanted to build knowledge of the plant growing process. We wanted to talk about these overall categories of vegetables. So this graph shows what children learned from the study, okay? So I want you to focus on this green line. So right here, this was children's knowledge of the words we taught at pre-test. So you can see they didn't know very much, which is to be expected. We hadn't taught them yet. And then here's their knowledge of words at post-test. So you can see they really learned a lot about words. They really learned all of the words we taught them, which is actually pretty unusual for a vocabulary study where children typically only learn like a smaller portion of the words that are taught. And our hypothesis was that it was because the words were related and they could draw on their knowledge of other words and connect it to the new words. So this suggests that teaching related words and building knowledge of a topic is a really promising approach for vocabulary learning. I also wanted to dig a little deeper and figure out what helps the kids learn those new words. So every time the teacher used one of the new words, one of the target words, I coded for whether, is she reading that word as part of a book? Is she giving a definition of that word? Or is she using some kind of visual support like a picture, right? So, and then I looked at how that related to kids' word learning. So again, this graph, anything above the 0 shows a positive relationship with word learning. Pay attention to the gray bar, that's the one that's significant. We can, that little asterisk just means if we were to do this study again, we could rely on the fact that this effect would show up again, right? So it's just a statistical thing. But yes, the gray bar is the exciting one also. So this shows that the kids really learned a lot just from hearing them in the context of the book. And just to give you more context myself, I think this is because we used a rich informational text. The book was providing a lot of great information about the words, right? The teachers didn't need to say so much more because we were reading the books 4 times and the books were really great and full of rich content. So this really indicates that the content you choose is really important in building conceptual knowledge. So a couple takeaways. I talked about building those interconnected networks of knowledge. Kids can learn a lot about new words from a really rich shared book reading activity that's repeated over time. And it can be helpful to teach words that are conceptually related to one another. Okay, I'm going to move to my second kind of talk, responsive talk. So this is talk that responds to children's questions or overtures. So if conceptual talk was mostly teacher initiated, like the teacher's really getting that interaction going, the responsive talk is really, it's the kid who's getting this conversation started, right? And then what is the teacher doing in response to that? And again, this is a kind of talk that's been shown in the research to help support kids' oral language development. So let me give you some examples. So one responsive language strategy that's often used is what we call expansions, or expanding children's talk. So this means repeating what kids say and adding something extra to it to make it more complex or to rephrase it into some different syntax. And that helps provide the model for children's language learning. So for example, that child says 2, and the teacher says, that's right, you moved 2 spaces, right? So she's just echoing and adding. We can also extend topics. So we can develop their ideas to talk about topics beyond the here and now, which has been associated with language development. It also puts the conversational ball back in children's court, right? So the child says, that car's wheel is broken. And the teacher joins in the play and says, yes, it's broken. I wonder how a race car driver will get home, right? So she's extending that play topic and taking it to this kind of imaginary realm, which is also helpful for thinking about language. The final responsive talk strategy, which is effective, is to ask questions or make comments that encourage kids to talk further. And I have just a few examples for you here, like how do you know? Why do you think? Can you tell me more? And these are questions that we can really use. I think they're most fruitful in small group settings, at mealtime, right? Choosing the setting for responsive talk is really important too. Okay, one last example. So you all know that typically classroom conversations take the form of initiate, respond, evaluate, right? Where the teacher is initiating, the child is responding, and then the teacher evaluates their comment, right? So I'd like us to think, instead of evaluating on that third turn, instead let's investigate, right? So in this example, the teacher says, what do you think the caterpillar will do next? And the child says, take a nap. And the teacher says, he's gonna take a nap inside his cocoon. Yes, good thinking. And she's expanding what he's saying, which is great, but she's also evaluating and kind of closing it off. So the child is like, okay, we're done here. So the third turn, instead, I suggest ask an open-ended question. Ask a question to probe the child's thinking. So instead, this teacher says, I wonder why he needs to take a nap. And the child says, he's sleepy because he ate all that food. And the teacher says, he did eat a lot. I think he might use that food for energy to turn into a butterfly. So you can see it gives the child an opportunity to use their language to further develop their thinking. And then it also gives the teacher a chance to share some conceptual information about something the child is interested in. Okay, that brings me to my last point. So I just want to discuss this part of my Venn diagram where it overlaps, right? So this is kind of like the sweet spot of classroom instruction. It can be a little hard to get here, but it's talk that focuses on both, that's both responsive to what children are interested in, but also gives opportunities to build knowledge. So again, I conducted a study where I was interested in figuring out what kind of interactions help kids learn new words. So not just like what we're saying, but what kind of interaction is going on. Is the teacher getting things started? Is the child getting things started? Is it kind of an equal roles? So the first category I looked at was instructional interactions, where the teacher is sharing some information about a new word, right? The second kind was what I called responsive/conceptual. So the child is asking a question, what's that yellow one? And then in response to what the child is saying, the teacher supplies some conceptual information. So the teacher says, that's a daffodil. It's a flower that blooms in the spring. And then the last category is called active processing in the literature. And it's questions that we can ask about words to help kids understand words better, asking about kind of nuances of word meaning. Okay, so here are the results. So I looked at these interactions in 2 settings, again, during book reading and during play. We didn't have significant results for book reading, so I'll discuss the ones from play. So you can see this orange bar is responsive conceptual. So the kinds of interactions that were related to word learning were the ones where the child was saying something about a word and then the teacher was responding with additional information. Notice that the instructional, they didn't really do too much in this study, right? They can be powerful if the children are listening and engaged, but I think in this study we were doing a lot of talk, and so it was especially powerful when the kids were asking us about things, and then we could supply that information. And then the active processing, those were the questions we asked kids about words, significantly and negatively related to word learning. And you'll probably be able to guess why if you see the setting we did them in during play, What would happen if you asked your preschoolers a bunch of questions about words during play? They probably would ignore you, right? That's mostly what happens in our study. So, what did we learn from this study? Word learning is most effective when it's interactive and bidirectional. And by bidirectional, I mean teacher and child are involved. So that means having a classroom climate that encourages talk about words, right? Children ask questions about words when they know that that's valued in their classroom. Children are interested and engaged in the topic at hand. And then teachers are prepared to notice children's questions and comments and to respond in a way that supports learning. So a few final thoughts. Pre-K literacy is much more than the ABCs. To build stronger readers, we need to lay a foundation that's broader than letter knowledge in early childhood. It's really the oral language skills that are necessary for later reading comprehension, in combination with some decoding skills. So reading to learn requires a strong vocabulary, background knowledge, syntax, and familiarity with different types of texts. And these abilities are all growing from children's oral language skills. If we make the investment of supporting children's oral language skills throughout early childhood, they can draw on these resources to make meaning from text throughout their lives. And that is it. Thank you very much.
So what I'd like to do is to shift our attention a little bit to the population of children who are learning two languages simultaneously. Children who are learning perhaps English at school and another language at home. 1 in 5 children in the United States speak a language other than English at home. And we know that this is a population where we find a great deal of variability, within population variability. You might find in this population of dual language learners, children who are pretty balanced and equal in their language abilities in both their languages. And you will find children who are less balanced and unequal. And so you get sort of a full range of children who may be low in one language and high in the other, all the way up to sort of pretty high in both languages. And so within this larger population of dual language learners, there is a special category of children that within the federal sort of language we refer to as English language learners. So these are children, about 9% of the school-age population, who speak a language other than English at home and have demonstrated to have low proficiency in English, such that there are concerns that they would not benefit from the standard curriculum delivered in English, and hence are eligible for services under Title III to support their English language development. When we look at this population, a large percentage of them, about 3/4 of this population, are children who speak Spanish as their home language. And then the other sort of 25% is highly, highly varied. The largest low incidence language within that 25% is 4% of the 25, and those are Vietnamese speakers, and you have many, many languages represented. One of the things we know about English language learners in relation to the topic of tonight's talk is that when we look at their literacy achievement over time, we find that English language learners catch up to their monolingual English-speaking peers fairly quickly, sometimes even outperforming their monolingual English-speaking peers on what we might refer to as low-level literacy tasks, sort of the decoding phonological awareness. Where we don't see that catching up is in the domain of comprehension, and vocabulary has been the sort of skill that seems to be the roadblock here. So building vocabulary for English language learners has been sort of an interest very close to my heart, and I think you're starting to see a lot of attention in how to sort of build interventions to do this. Now, with that in mind, I want to make, I think, 4 points that connect to Liz's talk. So the first thing has to do with the notion of language representation in bilingual children. So if you might recall the figures where there were the distributions of the words, the sort of word maps. So imagine 2 of those, right, for each language. So we think of the bilingual lexicon, bilingual representation of words as 2 separate stores, right? We have words represented at the lexical level for one language and word represented at the lexical level in another language, but all those labels connect to a common conceptual representation. Now, I bring this up because I think it makes the point that there is a great deal of instructional efficiency that can be built if we recognize that structure of the bilingual vocabulary. Because if you have built a conceptual representation for a word in one language, acquisition of that word in another language is a process of label acquisition. It's much simpler than conceptual building. Often we forget that. Often we forget that there is a whole set of resources that can be exploited and that can be used to build efficiencies in instruction because there are many, many words that they need to learn. How am I on time? Related to that, I'd like to bring up the point that Liz made around conceptual development. Again, I sort of call our attention to the fact that you could do a lot of knowledge building, even with children who have low proficiency in English and for whom your priority is, of course, to also build proficiency in English, but you could do a lot of conceptual building by supplementing materials in the classroom with materials in the child's first language. Making sure that you have background books, informational books that might relate to the topic that you'll be teaching about, that the children might be exposed to. Maybe you send them home. Maybe you have individuals on staff that can read these books with the children. Building that conceptual knowledge, building that sort of rich representations of concepts, and as Liz was saying, not just sort of knowledge of the individual concepts, but the relationships with them would be something that you could, again, more efficiently build if you recognize the resources that are there for the children. 2 more points. The issue of the intensity of the vocabulary instruction. So with English language learners, we have found in the research that we have done that mere exposure to words in text does not do much to build their vocabulary and grow their vocabulary. We have found that we need intensive, redundant strategies that can really help them exploit all of the cues to meaning that are present. So even though word definitions have sort of a bad rap in instruction, people don't like to use dictionary definitions, and there are good reasons for not using dictionary definitions. But with English language learners, definitions can be a very productive instrument if they are child-friendly definitions. And child-friendly definitions are very difficult to create on the spot and on your feet. And if there are educational publishers out there, one huge contribution would be to provide child-friendly definitions in materials. Using images, using total physical response, acting out, the combination of those strategies seems to be productive in growing children, English language learners' vocabulary. And finally, I'm going to make a point around the back and forth conversations. There's a lot of work that I think we need to do on that front relative to English language learners, because they will be the children in your classroom, or many times they will be the children in your classroom that will remain silent. And so this is where having good scaffolding techniques for pooling language from the children, even if it involves giving them the language you want them to produce. There's strong evidence that English language learners need to produce language in order to learn it, as Liz was also saying. And so I think that's going to be one area where we're going to see a lot of work developing around English language interventions for English language learners, because as the topic becomes sort of more central to the work the general sort of early childhood literature, researchers who study English language learners will be looking at that as well. And that's all. Thank you.
So since I do work with English language learners or dual language learners, I'm going to go next because a lot of what Maria said I want to jump on as well. But I wanted to start with just a recap of the points that I felt needed to be reheard, because we need to hear things multiple times in order for them to stick, as we know from information processing. So I think that the importance of language in preschool classrooms cannot be overstated, right? We really need language, and I'm a language researcher, so I'm saying that, but we really do need a lot of language going on in preschool classrooms. And we know from the research that oral language development, in addition to decoding, really is what leads to effective reading development and can really help solve the literacy issues in this country. So that's important to mention as well. And then we also know that both quality and quantity of language matter, right? So we used to think that just hearing a lot of words, being exposed to a lot of words was good enough, but we've recently figured out that that's not enough. So just hearing words isn't enough. It's also about the type of language that we're hearing, and we saw some of that in Liz's responses or studies, is that the type of language that we're hearing and how we're engaging in this language with young children is as important as how much language that they're hearing. So both quantity and quality of language are critical in helping children develop language skills. So children need to be exposed to language through conversations. They need to be exposed to language through hands-on learning and playing, and they need to be exposed to language through book reading. So they need all of these different types of interactions with language in order to really internalize and be speaking and learning that vocabulary. They also need to hear both responsive and contextual language, right, to help build their vocabulary. And so tying that into my own research, I do research on language development in preschool classrooms with dual language learners in particular. And so a lot of the issues that Maria brought up are things that I'm also seeing in my own research. And so I wanted to tie in a little bit of what Liz was talking about, but in relation to dual language learners and thinking about our dual language learners in our classroom, because they are a large portion of particularly our early childhood children in our schools. And so what we know is that often our dual language learners are also children who are coming from low-income homes. And so they may already be exposed to less language or less of the, or more social cultural language that is less congruent with some of the language that they're going to need in order to be able to be successful in reading. And so we need to make sure that those quality language interactions are there for those students, right? We need to make sure we're being very intentional in the type of language that we're providing for our students so that they can really benefit from those interactions. And in addition, because our dual language learners are usually exposed to a language at home that's different from the language at school, we need to make sure that we're accounting for that as well, right? So they're not going to be successful in language skills in English if they don't speak English, right? And obviously, and most of our educational programs are actually in English. So if they're coming into the schools not speaking English and are expected to perform in English, they're not going to be successful. So we need to find ways to help them to be successful, which is where my research comes in. And so in my most recent research, I've been looking at what's going on in the home in terms of language and what's going on in the classroom in terms of language. And what we've been finding is at home, in a sample of 450 families that we followed, Latino families around the country, over 56% of the moms don't speak English. They only reported speaking Spanish, right? So oftentimes teachers will tell the parents, you need to start speaking English with the children to build their vocabulary and their language skills so that they can be successful in reading. What happens when these moms don't speak English, right? So 56% of the families did not speak any English at home. And in addition to that, there was another 25 or so percent that spoke very minimal English. So that's almost 75% of our Latino families that don't speak any English. So we need to consider that when we're thinking about how we're introducing language in the classroom and how we're expecting children to have these conversations in the classroom if they're coming in with no English. So we need to find ways to connect the skills that children are bringing into these classrooms in their home language and help promote their language and literacy development, both in English and in their home language, because our research really shows that a foundation and strength in their home language can help with that transition into English. And so continuing to build on the skills that they have at home and that conceptual knowledge that Maria was talking about is critical as we're introducing language skills in English for the children. And in terms of classroom interactions and the work I've been doing in classrooms, some of the strategies that we've been finding are very similar to the strategies that Liz has been finding in her own research. And we see that more conversations need to be occurring in the classroom, right? Conversations is really the key for building language development. So teachers need to be engaged in responsive, sustained, conceptual conversations with children in which they can systematically, explicitly introduce new words, help them connect these new words in English to the words they may already have in their home language so that you can build on labeling. So take advantage of those funds of knowledge those children are coming into the classroom with in their own language and tying that in those semantic networks to some of the words that they already have in their own language. The other thing we're seeing is that conversations really need to be encouraged to occur not only between teachers and children, but between peers. We're finding a lot of rich peer interaction going on, particularly in play, in the children's home languages. So if the children are playing with other children in their home language, and even if the teacher doesn't speak that language very well, those peer interactions between the children can be really rich and add to the conceptual understanding that they're having. So those conversations don't have to happen in English. They can happen in the child's home language. They can happen bilingually. We see that earlier in the school year, children might speak all in Spanish to each other, and then they start adding English, and so there's some translanguaging going on where there's English and Spanish, and then maybe towards the end of the year, there's more English going on as well. And that's great, because it's really about using language, right? Because they need to use language in order to learn language. And unlike some of the research that was up there in terms of talking about decontextualized language, with dual language learners, we really want more contextualized language. So we need, for those definitions and those responses, and so children understand what the words are, we really need to talk about things that are going on in the present. So during play situations, it's a great time to introduce words that children could then understand. So providing a lot more contextualized language when children are just starting to speak is definitely a better strategy for dual language learners, whereas we see with children who speak English as a first language, some of the more decontextualized talk is better. So it's something to consider. One other thing is that these conversations really need to be intentional. So, and they should be occurring in small group and one-on-one interactions during playtime, center time. We're seeing a lot of whole group conversations going on in classrooms with these children for long periods of time. And when we code language, type of language talk that's going on in whole group, a lot of it is very teacher directed. So teachers talking to the children, which doesn't get them involved in these conversations and being engaged and learning the words. And what happens with the dual language learners? They're usually sitting in the back not paying attention, so they're not really getting much out of it. So they get a lot more out of situations where they can be engaged in conversations with the teacher, with other peers during meal times, during playtime, or during small group time. So that's important to also consider, is that when the intentionality of these conversations and when they are occurring. So I really want to stress that conversations are critical, because we're realizing children are learning a lot of language by using language. We need to be engaging in conversation between teachers and peers. Dual language learners really need to have the opportunity to practice using their language, whether it's their home language or English. They need to be able to figure out how language works, some of that syntax piece. Obtain feedback on language use, which is important with those feedback cycles. They say that you should strive for 5 in terms of the conversation, so there should be at least 5 turns within a conversation so that there is that feedback loop and that extension and that responsivity. And we really need to be building on the language that these children already have and bringing in the information, the concepts and conceptual knowledge that they have, that they're bringing into the classroom, and using that to help build their English language skills as well. So in my research, I'm really finding that these conversations that are occurring, when they are occurring, these children are doing so much better, both in language and math. We're finding long-term predictive math improvements for kids who are engaging in more conversation, who are increasing their vocabulary. We're finding a lot of linkages between language and math skills. And so these kids are not only improving their language skills, they're also improving their math skills long-term. So again, it's important to engage DLLs in conversation, and it's also important to make sure that you're doing this in small group and play scenarios other than whole group. So that's what
So we need to transition because I'm not an expert in dual language learning, although I dabble in it. So I want to kind of go back to basics because I kind of agree with the point that we need to kind of hear some of the major tenets of what it is that we're here to learn about on multiple occasions. And we're all educators, and my first tenet is that teaching matters. You know, it's criminal to think that we have such poor reading results. We know that it's malleable. It's a set of skills that every child should be able to learn, with very few exceptions. And we also know what we teach matters. You know, so a lot of our discussion could center around what it is that we're going to teach, even if we just talk about vocabulary, because that has been sort of central to the conversation today. There are a lot of decisions to make. So I'm going to start off with a little story, and then but I want to come back to the fact that a lot of this has to do with what Maria said about building efficiencies. I think that that's the thing that kept me going as an intervention researcher over the years. How can we put these behaviors and our teaching tactics together in packages that are feasible and doable and meaningful and have a huge impact on children? So, you know, I've done lots of workshops, and, you know, storybooks are a great mechanism, platform for teaching vocabulary, language, conceptual knowledge, and they're highly accepted across many cultures. There are a lot of advantages to using books. So when I've done workshops and I've had preschool teachers bring in books from their classroom, I'll pull one out of the crowd and I'll read the book out loud, and that's always fun. And I say, what I want you to do is write down all the words that you think your preschool children don't know. And inevitably, they will come up with something in the neighborhood of 12 to 20 words from your typical preschool book that they have in their classroom. And then I say, okay, that's a lot of words. Are you going to teach them all? No, that's too many. So how are we going to decide? You know, and there's some 10-minute discussion, and we can sort of hone it down to, you know, the selection of words. And then I say, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to write child-friendly definitions for those words. 2 minutes goes by, and they say, well, I'm almost done. Give me a little more time. And you think about the fact that we expect teachers to be able to read these books to children, select the most appropriate words to teach, come up with definitions, multiple contexts, you know, so that they truly understand and develop more knowledge about these words. It's not really that realistic that many teachers can do that. Some are really very proficient at doing that. It probably takes a lot of practice and a lot of experience to get good at that. So how do we build interventions that short circuit that whole process? So that was one of the tasks that was something that we took on a number of years ago. We basically wrote books, embedded words that were challenging for children, selected because they had the potential to have high utility in future texts because they cut across different disciplines and contexts and things like that. We recorded the books. We had a professional narrator. We had an illustrator that did beautiful pictures of these books. Children had books with little activities in them. We started off with activities that were too complicated because they really distracted the children from what it was that we were trying to focus on. But we, did a lot of iterative development to kind of come up with books with embedded activities and kids saying words and saying definitions. We start off with 2, we have 4 words in these books. And, we're doing comprehension lessons. We're trying to figure out what is it that we can do that can easily be implemented in classrooms. And we've had a high degree of success. Because if I think about going a little bit beyond the simple view of reading, where vocabulary comes in is if you're able to decode a word and you don't know what that word means, that really slows you down in terms of becoming a fluent reader. So when I think about language comprehension, I think about more than just at the word level. Comprehending text is, involves inference, making inferences and things like that. There's so much to this. And the other thing I wanted to reinforce is this idea that because we have these books with these embedded lessons in them, we can do a very cool experiment where we can provide these exact same books with the exact same narration, pictures that go along with our targeted words, and just pull out those embedded lessons. Children rarely learn those words. So we have really good evidence that reading to children, while it's a good thing, isn't sufficient to learn challenging words, and especially challenging words that are carefully selected. And we know that modeling is a very powerful teaching tool. Observational learning is a mechanism that, we know a lot about. And we have to take into consideration all the things that we know about observational learning so that we can predict when it's going to happen and when it isn't. And I'm not going to talk about about observational learning unless that comes up in question and answer. The other thing that's interesting about language researchers is that we're terrible with our own use of language. We lack a lot of precision. When Liz was talking about conceptual talk, I'm going, I wonder what that is. Because I have a different word for it and a different way to describe it in terms of decontextualized talk. And but a lot of it has to do with, we use language to teach language. That conceptual talk or decontextualized talk is sort of meta-linguistic in nature. It's using language to teach language and so forth. And then we didn't really talk very much at all about how do we measure word learning, because it's not an all or none phenomenon. Kids might be able to recognize words. They might be able to identify words or given a set of pictures. That's easier than being able to label those words and be able to recall the words, and then giving definitions and then using them in the right context. I mean, it's a whole range of skills that are involved in word knowledge, right? So how do we measure that? Because sometimes that'll have an impact on how we interpret our data. And then when you were talking about responsive talk, it made me think about what we're really here to talk about is how to teach. And one of the strategies I was thinking about was incidental language teaching, which has been one of the most widely studied strategies for teaching language to preschoolers. And I was thinking how, in many ways, it does represent the sweet spot that you were talking about, because it capitalizes on what the child is interested in and what they say, and it's prompting elaborated language that's modeled by adults with the expectation that the child will use that language in order to get the thing that they want, something that's desirable. So it's modeling slightly more sophisticated language than the language that they're using. It's responsive to their interests. It sets the occasion. You're taking advantage of those teachable moments. It's providing opportunities to respond, because that seems like, from my understanding of education, the most important aspect of predicting learning is whether children are actually using the behaviors that you're teaching, and there are positive consequences for them using that language. You know, so I have this tendency to kind of go back to basics, you know, but it isn't as easy as it seems, trying to put everything together, all these various tips and strategies. But it's what we should be working on, is how to make this feasible and how we can make it so that all children are successful. And my career started in the world of severe disabilities, and now I'm working more with children who come from more impoverished home language environments, now knowing the huge disparities in American homes and what that means in terms of how children enter school and what their learning trajectory looks like. We can do better, but we have to continue to study these things and figure it out.
I get privileged to bring up the rear here, and I am going to start by telling you I am a convert language researcher, okay? And what I mean by that is that I used to be the phonics teacher, right? Hardcore about phonics, teaching decoding, and that was my training, and that's what I did. But I came upon the need for oral language when I discovered that a good chunk of the kids I was teaching to decode could not understand what they were reading, right? And nobody ever warned me of that. The sentiment was clearly that if you teach children phonics and they can decode well and fast, they will comprehend. Like, that was the kind of guarantee I got, right? But guess what? That was not true. I became an oral language researcher because this was a problem in some cases I caused when I was a teacher, when I was a school psychologist. So call it redemption. Right? The great thing is I have learned so much about oral language that I can now be effective and maybe repay some kids, right? Pay it forward. And I'm also a serious pragmatist. I've been an interventionist and intervention designer. So, and this is a skill that I acquired through lots of instructional design training around phonics. And maybe if you're familiar with direct instruction, really strong phonics-based teaching approaches. The nice thing is I've been able to take the science and the principles that have applied and have taught me very well there to the efficient and effective and powerful teaching of oral language. So it's been my career's mission to make the teaching of oral language better and more efficient and easier to do, right? And I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to tell you how to do that, right? It's going to be quick. The answer is oral storytelling, okay, right? That's the answer, all right? We love storybook reading. I would never stop reading to kids, never, ever, okay? But as they have all said, that children also need to use language, right? And it's particularly important for our kids who are disadvantaged, right? Or that might be sitting in the back of the classroom fading into the carpet, right? Oral storytelling is culturally appropriate. Almost all cultures and ethnic groups in this world use oral storytelling. So it can be culturally grounded, very appropriate. It's personally relevant, right? So the prior knowledge that Liz was talking about, when you're talking about storytelling, children can talk and tell stories about things that are relevant to them, okay? And that increases their motivation and interest in engaging in that conversation, okay? In addition, all of the skills that you need for reading comprehension, and I'm going to review them, right? They are understanding text comprehension. Liz had a slide on this, and I'm just converting it into the terms that I like to use. Text comprehension, right, are things like story grammar for a narrative, right? Or things like main idea, key details of an expository text, right? So that's text structure. You need that. You need vocabulary. You also need syntax and grammar, and inferencing skills. All of those skills are what you need to be able to, combine and unite to fulfill reading comprehension functions. All of those things are innate and easy to tie up together in oral storytelling because you work on text structures, right? And as you're teaching text structures, guess what? You have to have sentences that go with it. And in fact, the sentences in oral storytelling are longer and better because they require some sophistication because your listener was not there experiencing the thing you're telling them about. So you become more specific, use longer, more complex sentences when you tell stories than when you're talking about something like my coat here. Okay, so that's syntax, complex syntax. Guess what? There's also vocabulary. Lots of vocabulary in storytelling. And you can embed these complex words, conceptual words, whatever it is, those words can be embedded in the stories that kids are practicing retelling. And finally, inferencing. Inferencing is about the connection between the elements of the story. Okay? It's more important that they have relations between these events and they understand that this caused this or this comes before this than just listing a bunch of events, right? And that develops inferencing. Okay, so oral storytelling has more advantages. I'm just gonna get rid. Children like to do this, right? They get attention for it. They like to do it, and they will continue to do it outside of your classroom and outside of a structured teaching session, right? It's doable in small groups, large groups, one-on-one, because the children do not just have to practice storytelling with the teacher. They can turn and tell each other stories. Or, hey, go home and tell your parents the story. Guess what? My homework is to tell stories? Awesome, right? Young children are naturally motivated to tell stories about the experiences that they have in their lives. So also, because they're naturally motivated to do it, the skills or the complex language that we're promoting naturally generalizes and they get more practice doing it over time. Okay? It's also socially beneficial. Children who tell better stories have more friends. They're more popular, right? And they sustain the attention of others longer and better. What's better than that? I don't have to give some child a sticker because he told a story. He's already getting the attention and friends he wants, okay? Let's see, academic benefits, I think it's pretty clear. In schools, kids are asked to retell what they just read, right? This is a common procedure, okay? And then finally, for families or preschool sites who have low resources, right? And that maybe do not have the money to purchase books or may not have the literacy skills. Oral storytelling is a phenomenal substitute for book reading, right? So it can be done easily without extra cost. It's naturally motivating and it covers all of the oral language skills needed to build toward comprehension. And then once you teach it, it keeps on going. Thank you.
And so I'm a teacher, I'm interacting with a preschooler in my class, and I want to be in that sweet spot between responsiveness and conceptual building, but I've got this curriculum press at my back. And so I've got to be emotionally and conceptually present. I'm thinking about the load that puts on the teacher at that moment in time. How I'd like to do that every time, but I bet I don't because I don't have time.
Yeah. I don't know if you heard Jim's question. He was asking about the idea of the sweet spot between responsive and conceptual talk and how teachers are pressed to enact this curriculum, and it can be difficult to carve out the time to have one-on-one conversations with children in general, much less be responsive to their needs and then support their conceptual development at the same time. And I think that's very true. I think I have a reading teacher article that just came out that talks about this a little bit, especially for children in your class whose language skills may not be well developed or who may be more reserved. What are some ways you can create the conditions for this kind of talk, right? So I think one of the most important things is choosing the appropriate setting and choosing the appropriate materials. So in the article, I give the example of small group being this ideal time to have conversations with children and making it intentional, choosing the 2 or 3 kids who you notice, hey, maybe they're not talking a lot. My small group time this week is going to be devoted with talking with them one-on-one, doing an art project together, doing a Play-Doh sculpture together, and using that as an opportunity to have this kind of talk. I think if we depend too much on these moments arising just naturally, it's difficult to make them happen, so we need to create the kinds of structures and use the kind of materials that will help them happen more consistently in our classroom.
Yeah, and I think that we actually use sweet spot a little differently, you know, because yours was more tightly constrained around the responsive and conceptual talk. And I think about it in a more general way where we're thinking about how do we blend target behaviors, you know, that may be across domains or related domains, and also teaching techniques, so, or teaching components so that they can be as efficiently used as possible. And where we do definitely agree is that it takes planning. You know, the idea that you can just do this on the fly is where we build up this expectation that people really can't meet. You know, so, you know, we have to think again about how do we develop lessons that are going to be able to be implemented efficiently, with fidelity, and they're short and they're fun, you know, and kids are you know, responding and reinforced. You know, we have to plan it. We have to develop those lessons.
I wonder if there's an amount of permission that we need to provide for teachers, that this is okay to do. This isn't just burning the clock. This is instructional. This is, you know, you're present for a kid, and that's valuable.
Would you mind if I actually talk about that?
Yes.
I really wanted to talk about measurement. As a matter of fact, this slide is all about measurement. But I got nervous. No. I think the reason why we often don't give teachers permission to talk and to work on oral language is because there are very few measures that teachers are accountable to implement or deliver in their classrooms. And measurement, you know, we say weighing a pig doesn't make it grow, but what gets tested gets taught. This is absolutely a detriment to oral language, right? Oral language, and to do it well, right, is very challenging to measure reliably and validly, right? And oftentimes that's the reason why it's being minimized in our primary grades, okay? So measurement innovation is essential. And honestly, these are some of the people here have been working on innovations for this. And also, I was a school psychologist before I was a language researcher. So I have some experience with developing assessment tools for this purpose. And I have developed assessment tools, and because of this new innovation around measuring oral language in this complex way, right? We can actually measure reading comprehension before children can read. Should I say that again? Yeah. Measure reading comprehension before children can read because of precise and important measurement. Now, vocabulary is the easiest to measure out of all the oral language skills, and it tends to be the one that gets emphasized most in research because it's easy to measure, right? But just because you're measuring it doesn't mean it's the only thing that's important. So our challenge as oral language researchers is to increase the innovation and be very brave to push the boundary in the development and validation of appropriate and meaningful oral language measures that teachers can use easily in their classrooms.
Do we have questions?
We do. I'll ask one. How can we develop oral language skills in atypical learners, such as individuals with communication deficits, ASD, etc.?
Storytelling works really well. I got a lot of research on it with those learners.
Yes, but what about kids who are emergent communicators that we would consider nonverbal? They don't speak and they're having to
So the storytelling interventions that I've done are being used by AAC users, and they are producing storytelling. Certainly a level of preparation is needed to, like what you're saying, programming the AAC device, and creating or selecting stories that are appropriate and that would be relevant, maybe personally relevant, or culturally relevant or meaningful for that child, because we don't want an individual with AAC learning to use words that he's not going to use in his daily life, right? And so making the stories very personally relevant or realistic to them is really important. We can talk more about that.
Yeah, I mean, outside of that context of oral storytelling, I think that in general, you're trying to teach communication, and communication at its very basic level, using the same ideas, modeling, appropriate language, even if it's nonverbal language to begin with, being responsive to children's needs, desires, and interests, providing opportunities and prompting them to respond, and making sure that they get positive consequences. I mean, it's still the same basic stuff, although the behaviors you're teaching are at the much more basic level of communication and social communication, in the case of children with autism in particular.
I actually have a question I'd like to follow up with Lisa and Maria. I've spent a lot of time working in cultural groups where oral expression, especially among males, young males, is not necessarily very highly prized. And in fact, not being self-expressive is what's valued, the sort of stoic, somber kind of presentation. Does that interfere with the concept of oral language as a development, as a precursor for reading, or is that something? Is that? I'm trying to imagine how some of these kids, who are even from quite a young age, sort of trained and encouraged not to be very expressive. Is that something you've ever run across? I mean, it's, what forget I asked?
So, I think that there are lots of examples of, oral language not being nearly as sophisticated as written language. However, there is a whole culture around hip hop music and rap music that uses pretty sophisticated language and language structure, right? So there may be other avenues that maybe we could take advantage. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my immediate response to that, I guess, is just being aware of the fact that when we ask children to perform language tasks in ways that are sort of consistent with the school way of doing things, we're asking them to change their culture. And I think all I have to respond is to say that sensitivity to that shift in cultural presentation and identity needs to be taken seriously. And I don't think we do often pay attention to that.
And I'll add to that I think part of that stoicism is probably what they've been taught in terms of how they're supposed to behave and how they're supposed to act in a certain situation. And so when we've gone into homes and we've seen how children, it's not that they don't have language or they're not engaging in language, it's how they're being cultured and what we're finding, what we particularly find with dual language learners, particularly of Latino descent, is that they have very high social emotional skills, right? That's the one thing parents are really teaching these kids is how to behave, right? And so behavior is the first thing and so that is part of the behavior and the cultural expectations for these children. So it's not that they don't have language. And so oftentimes we do have to go into the homes and we see how these children are interacting with their peers, and their interactions with peers and conversations with peers may look very different than that with teachers. So we need to take into consideration what are the conversations and interactions and who are they interacting with as we think about what is culturally relevant for these children. How can we use that to help them be more successful?
So for both of you, are you advocating that we're teaching children to be more bicultural as well as being bilingual?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I think so.
You know,
I think
because we
it's-
could be very explicit about that, and maybe that would help.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need to teach children to be bicultural and bilingual so that they know how to operate. And to some extent, we do that even with our monolingual English speakers, right? So, not necessarily the culture of your neighborhood and the culture that you have with your friends may not necessarily mimic that culture, that academic culture that's expected of you at school. And so we really need to take that into consideration and think about what are the resources that children are bringing in that you can play on that make them feel comfortable, bring in that background and conceptual knowledge, and yet understand that there's a difference between that social cultural piece that they're bringing in and some of the academic piece that they need, and how to engage in both of those in appropriate ways.
We have a comment chat.
No, I just want to kind of piggyback on what you were mentioning, because I see with those kind of a smaller population, the Central American and Mexican population, they're kind of more subdued with their language skills at the younger age. I'm from the Caribbean, I'm Dominican, we're very loud, we talk a lot, all right? But then in other cultures, and so what I'm hearing is, because I had a similar question, you have to be culturally responsive to that. So that means that the student then is going to be code switching, and then that cultural shift as well for the teacher and for the student, because when they go home, they're kind of going to be more quiet, subdued, but then they may not have the skill because they're not they don't have that oral language, that rich oral language that we expect at school. So I don't know, I'm trying to figure out how to bridge that, because then in that same classroom, you're going to have students where their oral language is here, and then students that culturally, because of where they're coming from, that's different. So that's a struggle.
So I have two thoughts on that. One is if you have children from these different similar but different cultural backgrounds, having them have peer interactions, they're more likely to be open with their peers than they are with adults, because a lot of that is respect in terms of not being loud and being quiet. And so being able to learn from each other and engaging in interactions with each other, we've seen is actually helpful for kids. So they are learning hopefully good words, right? From the kids that they're playing with and interacting with. The other thing in my work that I've done with Central American and Mexican families is there's some sort of reverence to the teacher, right? So they are going to be more, even the parents, even some of the teachers are going to, there's going to be some of that. But particularly with the boys, which I think is one of the pieces that we've been talking about, having that male teacher in the classroom is so important in helping them to be able to see those role models, and Howard talked about observational learning, right, and modeling. And so if they're seeing these male role models that look like them and act like them, but engaging in conversation and really showing some of the skills that we're talking about, the children will then start aspiring to do that and engage in more conversation and more interaction. So I think that piece is important, is having people in the classroom that look like them, that are engaging in these kinds of behaviors that we're looking for, because observational learning and modeling is so critical for this age group.
Thank you. I think our time is just about up for the evening. We so appreciate your attention and for making your way out here. Please don't hesitate to contact any of us. We're eager to connect with all of you and learn more from you as well. Thank you.